All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this talk on historic architecture and neighborhoods of New Orleans. I'm Serena Mohan. I am the Director of Public Programming and Events at the Preservation Resource Center, and we are so happy that you all are joining us for this. We are doing these live classes online 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 2 p.m. all month. So hopefully you guys will tune in for some more of them, but this one is going to be fantastic. Michelle Stanard Duhon is an expert on historic buildings. She is an incredible friend of the PRC and is going to share some really awesome history and let you guys know sort of how you can identify all sorts of different types of architecture from the 1800s and the 1700s, first half of the 1800s in New Orleans. Before she gets started, I just want to go through some of the logistics for those of you that haven't done an online webinar like this before. So you all are muted, your videos are off, but you are free to communicate with us and ask questions throughout the presentation. There should be a chat feature where you guys can type in your questions. I will be reading them to Michelle sort of as we go and as she's ready to take questions, but keep them coming throughout. You don't have to wait to the end to ask the questions, and I'll read them out to her to make sure that she knows what you guys are asking. You might also see a Q&A function. We're not necessarily using that today. If you put a question in there, I will get it, but feel free to use the chat. If you have a technology question, like if your sound is off or anything like that, you can send a message just to panelists or just to me, and I will help you work through all of that. In the meantime, I don't want to hold this up anymore, so I'm going to turn everything over to Michelle, and we can all start learning about this together. Thanks. Welcome, Michelle.
Hey, thank you. Thank you to everybody for being here today. I know these are crazy times we're living in, so thank you for carving out some of your time today to learn about historic architecture and neighborhood development in New Orleans. My name is Michelle. I come to the historic preservation practice primarily through construction, and I own two businesses, one that does hands-on restoration of art and architectural elements. The other does tax credits, research, things like that within the preservation field. So I kind of wear many hats within the field. So if you have questions afterwards about something that you feel like I didn't cover, feel free to ask. Okay, with that, I'm going to get started. Serena, can you just confirm that you're seeing everything correctly for me?
Yep, I see your whole screen. That looks perfect.
Okay, great. All right, so these are the topics of discussion that we're gonna go over today. We're pretty much gonna cover the first half of this presentation. Like Serena said, we're gonna get about halfway through our historic architectural styles. So with that, excuse me, we're gonna jump into neighborhood evolution. Okay, this is a map of New Orleans. This is a homemade map. I made this map. The reason this is a homemade map by yours truly is because I didn't really find a map out there that covered all of the information that I wanted you to be able to see. So excuse the fact that it's a little homemade looking, but it does have a lot of good information. Okay, we are gonna start with colonial architecture. Let's see, that. Okay, our colonial period, which is in red, from 1718 till 1803. Why does that end in 1803? If you are answering to yourself, that is the Louisiana Purchase. Great job, gold star, that's correct. So our colonial architecture, when we say colonial, we're talking about French colonial, Spanish colonial. In other parts of the country, primarily the East Coast, they're gonna be talking about English colonial. For us, again, French and Spanish. Now, in addition to looking at the red boxes, which is highlighting obviously the French Quarter, that's where our colonial architecture congregates because that's our oldest section of the city. I want you to look up here towards City Park. There's this little red box up here. We call that area Bayou St. John. And I want you to look what's around it. The most important thing on this map is not all the different patterns that you see. We'll get into that. The most important thing are these dark blue lines. Those are our waterways. Our waterways were our original thoroughfares. They were our highways, our major streets. They were our modes of transportation. So we're all familiar, hopefully, with this big one at the bottom. That's the Mississippi River. The French Quarter, sitting right there on the river. Up here, though, again, in that Bayou St. John area, we've got 3 bayous converging. Bayou St. John, which is this one stretching north towards Lake Pontchartrain. We've got Bayou Metairie over here to the left. And then we have Bayou Gentilly over here to the right. Where they all pretty much meet is where we had this pop-up of colonial architecture. Again, our bayous, which are natural waterways, canals, which we'll get into later, are man-made waterways. Our bayous are our thoroughfares. They're our modes of transportation. So we're going to learn a little bit about these today. Bayou St. John, which is still in existence, is and was always we'll call it the biggest bayou of the 3, the most easily transversed, and it took a straight shot up to the lake. Bayou Metairie, over to the left, this was never nearly as big or as easily used a bayou as Bayou St. John, but it was there. And it offered kind of this east-west connection that was very important. Now you ask, where is Bayou Metairie today? Good question. Bayou Metairie today is Metairie Road. Once it ceased being useful as a bayou or as a waterway, it was filled in and it became Metairie Ridge. That's why it's high ground. And then we stuck Metairie Road on top of it. That's going to be important for later architectural development because, again, we're always looking in New Orleans for high ground to build near or on top of. So that's Bayou Metairie. To the other side, to the east side of Bayou St. John, we have Bayou Gentilly. There's my mouse. Here. This was also kind of like Bayou Metairie, not always a perfect thoroughfare, not quite easily transverse like Bayou St. John, but again, offered everybody kind of an east-west thoroughfare. Bayou Gentilly, no longer there either. This becomes part of Chef Mentor Highway and parts of Claiborne Avenue. Bayou Metairie, I forgot to mention, if you do want to see parts of it, if you ever go into Metairie Lake Lawn Cemetery, which I'm circling with my mouse right now, I hope you can see that. There are long, kind of shallow, oddly shaped ponds that run through that cemetery. Those are pieces of the original Bayou Metairie. That's all that's really left. Bayou Gentilly, I don't think we really have anything left of. But again, stressing the importance of the locations of these waterways, because that's where you see our earliest architecture popping up. Okay, any questions so far, Serena?
No questions yet.
Great. All right, we're gonna move on to the post-colonial period. That's this area, or these areas, excuse me, in green. From 1803 to 1830 is when this architecture is developing. Again, 1803, Louisiana Purchase. So what's happening right now? Yeah, during this time, we've got the War of 1812 being one. This is also kind of the time of Jane Austen, horses and carriages. Picture that, if you will. Architecturally and in terms of neighborhood development, what are we doing? We're pretty much just expanding out from our colonial architecture, right? And now we're starting to link the French Quarter and Bayou St. John, and this would be along Esplanade and up through the Treme neighborhood. That's why you see a good bit of older architecture in those neighborhoods along that Esplanade Ridge and that Treme corridor, because they started to link what was already there, the oldest architecture. Now remember too, in the colonial period and the post-colonial period, a lot of these buildings, a lot of the architecture that was in existence were subject to fires. Especially in the late 1700s, we're losing a lot of the architecture that was already built because a lot of it was built primarily of wood. So at this point, you're starting to see more brick, plaster buildings being built. Attention to fire spread is starting to really pick up. So yes, post-colonial period, really just expanding out from where we already were, hugging the river, hugging the high ground. We do make the jump over to the West Bank. You see this little area over in Algiers Point. And you'll see a small area over in the Carrollton neighborhood. Now today we think of Carrollton as just being a hop, skip, and a jump down St. Charles Avenue from the rest of the city. But remember, at this time, we're dealing with horse and buggy, we're dealing with epidemics, fires raging. Carrollton was its own neighborhood. It was part of a different parish. This was a different town that you were traveling to. But again, because there's this little patch of high ground over here, and it was along a nice part of the river, they established some post-colonial architecture in this neighborhood. Okay, moving on to the Antebellum period.
Hold on, before you move forward, we do have a question. Someone wanted to know why they filled in Bayou Metairie and Bayou Gentilly.
Great question. Bayou Metairie and Bayou Gentilly, again, were, we'll say they ended up being more trouble than they were worth. Once trade started growing, ships were getting bigger. We wanted to move more goods. We discovered that Bayou Gentilly and Bayou Metairie were proving to be difficult. Again, remember, bayous are natural things. There's sediment and silt building up. They change. So they weren't necessarily easy to transverse ever, even under the best of circumstances. So later, let's see. And actually, during this Antebellum period that we're about to talk about, 1834, we build the New Basin Canal. And we say, to heck with these bayous, we're gonna draw a straight line, straight-ish, straight for New Orleans, from Lake Pontchartrain up here, all the way down into the heart of the city, where we'd have a turning basin. And this, it was dug by thousands of Irishmen, Irish immigrants, many of whom lost their lives in this process. But this essentially, if you have to compare them, taking Bayou Metairie and Bayou Gentilly to get your goods across town would be like taking River Road from St. James Parish into New Orleans. You can do it. It's kind of slow, one lane traffic, you know, not very efficient. This, the New Basin Canal, which again we started building in 1834, is like I-10 highway opening up. This is, man, straight shot, multiple lanes, easy peasy compared. So to answer the question, Bayou Metairie, Bayou Gentilly, never great. Decided just to let Mother Nature start to fill them in, and then we added to that process because land became more valuable. All right, moving on.
Couple more water questions.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So someone is noticing there is a line of a blue water line leading into the French Quarter. Can you explain that?
Yes, good question. So this was the old Carondelet Canal. Again, a canal is man-made. That's what we're talking about right through here. The old Carondelet Canal. This was built so that all of this trade going on, all of these goods being moved through the bayous, now we have a way, straight shot, to get them into the city. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. That's the Carondelet Canal. We kind of abandoned the Carondelet Canal when we have the New Basin Canal, because the New Basin Canal, again, is bigger, better, straighter, faster, all those things you want in transportation. Any other questions?
When was the Carondelet Canal built?
Oh, the Carondelet Canal is an old one. I don't know an exact year on that. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, so off of the water, we do have one question about Carrollton before you move on to the antebellum period. Someone's wondering if you know anything about who settled in Carrollton. This particular attendee has some German ancestors from the mid-19th century who lived in that particular neighborhood and would like to hear more.
Great. So we are, I'm going to use that as a jumping off point to my next section, actually. Good question. And then we'll get into a more specific little piece of lagniappe about Carrollton at the very end of the presentation. So all right, jumping into the antebellum period, 1830 to 1862. So these are just 30 years right before the Civil War. What do we see here happening? We're looking at our blue sections. We kind of start to see, we're still hugging the river a little bit, some high ground. We've got what we would call the Lower Garden District happening over here to the left of the corridor. We've got some Marigny and New Marigny development happening over here. More things on the West Bank, a good bit more development happening in Carrollton. So what's going on now? So after the Louisiana Purchase, after the War of 1812, again, this is going back into our post-colonialism a little bit, we start to see an influx of German, English, Protestant settlers. Most of these people are coming from other areas of the United States. After Louisiana Purchase, after the War of 1812, a few years past that, everyone hears, oh, New Orleans is ours. It's part of the country. It's been firmly established. That's a place to move. So the locals who were already here called them Kaintucks because a lot of them were from Kentucky. But again, English and German, mostly white, Protestant settlers start coming into these areas. They are not welcome by the French, Spanish, Catholic population who had already settled the older parts of the city. So where do they go? Well, they go mostly into these blue areas. You will see in New Orleans a very specific change in architecture between the French, Spanish, Catholic sections and the German, English, Protestant sections, not just because of the age of the building, but also because of the culture of the person that built it and lived there. And we'll get more into that when we start discussing our styles. But I hope that answers part of your question about the German settlers, who, yes, German settlers were all over Louisiana. They often don't get as much reference as French and Spanish, but they did have an enormous impact, as did the Irish, on South Louisiana. Any questions about that, Serena? Nope.
Nope,
okay.
Not yet.
Okay, moving on to, where are we? Victorian. Oh my goodness, look at the expansion during the Victorian period. You're gonna hear me say this a few times, and here's the first time. The Victorian is not a style of architecture. It is a period of time that includes many, many styles of architecture. We're gonna go through them later. When you hear somebody say, oh, I live in a Victorian building, you can kind of picture what they're talking about. We know generally what that means, but I want you to think to yourself, it's not really a proper way to use that term. Victorian describes a period of time, not a specific style of architecture. During the Victorian period, we're looking at this polka dotted section. Our city experiences quite a bit of expansion. Again, this is post-Civil War, before the turn of the century. And what are we starting to do? We're starting to really get further away from our high ground areas. We're getting further away from our rivers and our waterways. Oh, and I should have said earlier, I'm going to go back and do it now. This area, which is, we call Uptown, and really all the way up into the Mid-City area, and also this area to the right of the quarter. Most of this was privately owned land. They were plantations. There were sugar plantations and things like that. Some were owned by the Jesuits, some by the Ursulines, some privately owned by the founders of New Orleans themselves. As the city begins to expand, really from between post-colonial period and into the Antebellum and Victorian periods, these plantation owners are selling off their lands chunk by chunk to surveyors. They're acting as developers. They're saying, look, I realize what I can make growing and selling sugar, or I realize I can make a good deal more money and immediately if I just sell all of my land, subdivide it, slap a grid on it, and sell it to people who want to buy urban plots of land. So that's what's happening. Now, it would have been great if all of these plantation owners had talked to each other and they all said, you know, we're all going to get together and hire one surveyor. And that one surveyor is going to make a nice grid that extends evenly through the whole city. And all the street names are going to be the same. And it's all going to be very orderly. That did not happen. They each pretty much hired their own surveyor, put their own street grid on top of their sliver of land. And that's why you've got so many weird street changes and angles in our neighborhoods and one-way streets that suddenly become two-way streets. That's kind of where some of that madness comes from. But anyway, Victorian period, expanding quite a bit. Any questions, Serena?
Just a simple one. Someone is asking if you would be willing to make your map available after the fact.
Oh, sure. This beautiful map, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. We'll to everyone who's interested in that, we will figure out the logistics, and I'll let you know how you can get it.
Yes. Okay, so to round this out, early 20th century is our last period. Oh Lord, what happens? We abandon all our good ideas. We just start filling in the blanks. It's post turn of the century. We're looking at 2 world wars happening within here. You can see we're not sticking to high ground anymore. We're really just filling in where we can. Here we do kind of hug the Metairie Ridge, which that's at least an effort being made. Same thing along here, but oh my goodness. We're building in floodplains. Why? We'll get more into this later, but essentially at the turn of the century, the 20th century, we start looking west for a lot of architectural inspiration, meaning California, and not so much looking east, which we had done previously. As we start to look west for our architectural inspiration, we're looking at architecture that doesn't necessarily fit our environment. And we use some ideas that fit a Western climate and a Western environment, and we start kind of plugging them in here wherever we want to. The other thing we have going on in the early 20th century, we've got automobiles, so we can go wherever we want. We definitely get rid of all these canals and waterways. Those are completely useless to us now. We build highways and freeways and expressways, and we use those to get around, and we build them through neighborhoods and on top of old waterways, and who's to care, right? We'll get more into all that later. Okay, before I move on from our maps page, any other questions?
Yes, and this could be a much larger question. I think there'll be more to talk about next week. By the way, Michelle's doing the second part of this next Wednesday. But someone's asking specifically if you could speak to where there were concentrations of African American communities during the Victorian period.
Yes. So African American, we're going to start with Creole. Free people of color, Creoles, were always concentrated in the French Quarter and mostly east, so to the right of that. Treme was a very heavily populated area with free people of color, again, Creole populations. The Creoles are one of the original groups living in New Orleans. Again, French, Spanish, Catholic people, not necessarily huge fans of our English-speaking Protestants that came down from, the Kaintucks like we talked about earlier. So the short version of that answer is you're going to look to the French Quarter and to the right for our heavily Creole, free people of color, and African American populations. All right.
Oh, sorry, two more questions
Yes.
for you before we move on. So someone is saying in the Victorian period uptown were homes built first nearest to the river? And sorry, you have an answer?
Yeah. Yes and no. The expansion goes really more closest to the French Quarter and out, not so much river up, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. More question. Someone's saying your note in the bottom right corner says the new Basin Canal was a major influence on neighborhood development, and can you expound on that a bit?
Yes. So New Basin Canal is this dotted line. Again, we built that with Irish labor beginning in 1834. This was a huge deal to the city of New Orleans. This enabled much faster transportation of goods from across the lake to being within the city. What happens is in the early 20th century, or mid 20th century, really, 1950s, we fill this in and we replace it with a highway. This is the US 90 Expressway. We built directly on top of what used to be the New Basin Canal that connected the, what do we call it, the northern part of the city. And then all the way, they built the Crescent City Connection Bridge to the West Bank. So you can really see a lot of early 20th century development happening. Also, you have to think when they built this highway, or expressway, excuse me, they tore down quite a bit of fabric. So, having the waterway there changed the city the first time. Then having it become a highway totally transformed how people got around the city. And that suddenly made different parts of the city, especially like in Mid-City and Lakeview and Metairie, more accessible. But also the building of that highway tore a lot of historic architecture, especially in the central city neighborhood. It removed a lot of historic fabric there. And, by that point, to someone else's question, this area had a large African-American population. In the 1950s, the highway authorities, frankly, didn't care. They just bulldozed through some of that part of that city. So, anything else before I move on?
We're starting to get some questions about the architecture itself and sort of how it was built. So someone's got a question about whether or not homes that were built uptown during the Victorian period originally built as doubles, would have originally been built as doubles or multi-unit homes, or if that's something that maybe happened later. But I have a feeling you're going to get to some of that in a little bit. So I'm going to let you keep going. I just wanted to let them know that we'll get to that part.
Question heard and question will be answered. Okay. All right, we're going to move on. This is, again, still talking about neighborhood development. This is a point I want to make very clear. Neighborhoods are amorphous. especially in New Orleans, our neighborhoods have different boundaries and names based on who you ask. So some of our different types of neighborhoods, we have our local historic districts, our National Register districts, our cultural areas, neighborhood associations, which tend to be pretty small. Then we have the bigger wards and precincts. We have housing projects, parks, university, and landmarks. There are so many different ways to categorize neighborhoods, especially within a city as old as New Orleans. This map, this kind of multicolored map that you're going to see on the right of your screen, I put it up there. It was kind of I don't know, contentious might be a strong word, but this was a map put out by the city of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And this was a way for the city to organize its neighborhoods essentially and apply boundaries to things. Now, the problem with this map is when it came out, people looked at it and said, what? You've got me living where? Well, that's not where I live. I say that I live in such and such. And if you're familiar with the city, I want you to look down at the bottom along the river. You see the Irish Channel? It's got this like weird kind of square piece and then this long rectangle piece that extends all the way to Jefferson Avenue. Now, if you're familiar with the city now, you know that these boundaries do not align with the Irish Channel Historic District. They look kind of strange to you. You'll notice Uptown is teeny tiny. And what's interesting about this is I actually have a neighbor on Jefferson Avenue, or had a neighbor on Jefferson Avenue, who once said, oh yeah, well, this is part of the Irish Channel. I say it's Irish Channel because I'm Irish. I've always lived here. My parents and grandparents were Irish. They always lived here. It's the Irish Channel. So it's just this idea that neighborhoods can be easily classified. I kind of throw that out of your head a little bit. You know, they're amorphous, they're always changing, especially as the people who live there get older and move. So many variables to this. So we're going to get into my favorite kind of neighborhood classification, which is the local historic district. This is a line that one of my favorite professors taught me in school. All local historic districts have teeth. What does that mean? What are teeth? That means a local historic district is an overlay, and it is part of our safety and permits, part of our building code, it's got restrictions on it. So we in New Orleans control our local historic districts through the HDLC, which stands for the Historic District Landmark Commission. The HDLC has different types of control or different levels of control on local historic districts. So to use our teeth analogy, the HDLC has full control, here's our great white shark, over these local historic districts. There's a lot of them, right? Yes, there are. These districts, again, these local historic districts have very specific boundaries that are important to know if and when you are buying a house in New Orleans. Also, you'll notice down here, oh, I misspelled, I'm sorry. Esplanade Avenue only. That's because the HDLC has full control over houses along this street, but not necessarily all of the houses in the Esplanade neighborhood. So HDLC partial control, we have a picture, this is a wild African dog. And let me say that these pictures of these animals have nothing to do with what I think of the permitting process or the lovely people who take care of our permitting. They are just analogies. Our wild African dog has far less teeth than our great white shark. That's because these districts have partial control restrictions. Esplanade Ridge, except Esplanade Avenue, which we just talked about, the Garden District, and Carrollton. Carrollton is a new local historic district within New Orleans. So again, if and when you're buying a house in one of these neighborhoods, it is good to know what HDLC partial control is. You can find definitions and the differences between full control, partial control on the HDLC website under the City of New Orleans. Moving on, we have the HDLC's demolition review. We have a horse. Horse still has some teeth, but he's not nearly as dangerous as our dog or our shark. HDLC demolition review, Parkview, Mid-City, Uptown. That's not that scary. They're essentially reviewing demolition. However, once you go to the bottom of the screen, there is a new definition of demolition by the HDLC. Demolition used to mean demolition, where you bulldozed the entire building. Now, it means demolition, removal, replacement of 50% or more of the existing building. So you got to watch out for that. There's no more tearing down 90% of the building, saving the front facade, and calling that a renovation. That does not fly anymore. Another type of historic district, our National Register District. Our National Register District, I have a turtle. No teeth to this really. Almost the entire city is within a National Register District. This type of district is used mostly for tax credit purposes. It has no bearings on permitting. So any questions from this slide, Serena?
Yes, so we are hearing from someone that they are surprised that the Garden District is not under full control.
Are you?
Why might that be?
Good question. So St. Charles Avenue does have tougher restrictions. St. Charles Avenue, you will see, is under full control. Again, that's our shark. But why is the Garden District so safely and snugly tucked under partial control? Well, who lives in the Garden District? We have very influential people living in the Garden District, and how do we say this? They have fought to keep their neighborhood safely tucked under partial control because, again, full control is a whole different beast. And the people who live in the Garden District don't necessarily want to mess with this type, the great white shark type of permitting when they go to renovate their house. So that's more of a inherited political move, having the Garden District be there. Any other questions? No? Okay. Moving on. Okay.
Sorry, one quick question. Someone's wondering what the HDLC does versus the Vieux Carré Commission. So if you can just talk to that quickly, then
yes,
that would be great. I also just want to add one quick thing about the Garden District situation. One of the cool things about historic districting in general is that it's only one of the tools in the toolbox. So when we think about, when preservationists think about sort of all the ways that we can protect a neighborhood, there's also this level of sort of neighborhood buy-in, and the Garden District is fantastic about that. So the preservation community relies really heavily on these local districts and the teeth that they do have, but we also rely heavily on neighborhood organizations that sort of work with their own constituents to sort of create an environment where, everyone buys in and everyone does things a certain way with regard to preservation. The Garden District is an incredible model of sort of doing the right thing time and time again with their historic buildings, and the Garden District Neighborhood Organization has been an incredible steward for the preservation movement in this town. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, and we love historic districts. We love local historic districts and what they can bring. We also love residents that are, interested and willing to step up to the plate for preservation.
That's true. And yes, the Garden District is very, very good about self-policing. That is absolutely true. To answer the question about the Vieux Carré, so this is a little inaccurate. I have the Vieux Carré under the HDLC here. There should be in parentheses VCC next to the Vieux Carré. That would mean the Vieux Carré Commission. The Vieux Carré or French Quarter has its own permitting or own regulatory branch for historic preservation, the Vieux Carré Commission, and all they do is review building permits that come through the Vieux Carré or French Quarter. They are one of the two strictest historic districts in the United States, the other one being in Charleston. We're going to get into that in a little bit. They are one of the few commissions left that still review paint color. So yes, the Vieux Carré should kind of really have its own line here. We're going to talk about them in just a little bit. Anything else?
So, okay, so two more things. I just want to say we're already almost at 2:45. So I want to get to some of the architecture stuff. There are a couple more questions regarding historic districting. I'm going to put them in your lap, but then let's try to move to some of the architecture stuff. And I know we'll have some time next week for part two, but I don't want to miss out on all of that. One person was just sort of saying they wanted to mention that HDLC demolition definition includes 5% removal of the front facade. I'm just sort of reading this out as we go. And then someone else is asking if the city of New Orleans declares a building or a landmark, but it's not in a full control district, what are the limits on renovating or demolishing? If you can speak to those quickly before moving on to the architecture, that would be awesome.
Right. So within the definition of demolition, I think they meant 50% of removal of the front facade. That will kick in review, a demolition review. Yes, that is true. And the other question was, remind me the thread.
If the city declares a building a landmark, but it's not in a full control district, what are the limits on renovating or demolishing? But I think there's, you can answer that.
So if it's considered a local landmark, but it's outside of a full control district, it's usually going to have full control regulations on it. So yes. Okay, moving on. I do want to get into some of this architecture, so we're going to jump into this. This is a timeline. So again, we're starting here, our colonial period, which is French colonial architecture. If you remember our map, we're talking about the Vieux Carré and the Bayou St. John neighborhoods. What does that architecture look like? This is French colonial architecture, 1718 to 1803. Again, it's the rarest architecture in New Orleans, not only because it's the oldest, but also because a lot of it burned. It's found very sparingly in the French Quarter and Bayou St. John. This is a picture of the Pitot House in Bayou St. John. I believe this is the oldest building in the cities, the oldest house in the city still standing. And I want you to notice this. This is a building that was designed to work with its environment. You have this double gallery. A double gallery means essentially a balcony stacked on top of a porch. This is meant to catch breezes off of the waterway, off of the bayous, circulate air. We've got all of these windows and doors and transoms that can be opened. We are creating shade around the building. Again, trying to get cool air and breezes into this building. This is in this italics down at the bottom. Most examples of colonial style architecture that you see anywhere in the state of Louisiana really is actually a copy, a much later copy of the real thing. There is very little of the real thing still left. Yep. Okay. So moving on. Louisiana Purchase happens. Now we're in our post-colonial period, 1803 to 1830. We're talking about a much larger swath of the city now, many more neighborhoods. And a lot of these neighborhoods have different names. There's the Faubourg Sainte-Marie, or the American sector, which is also the warehouse district, part of the Lower Garden. Remember, we talked about all those names being kind of amorphous. We're talking about the Marigny and Esplanade Ridge and Treme, some parts of the Irish Channel. We're going to start with what we find in the French Quarter and a little bit in Treme and the Marigny. This is a Creole style of architecture. Again, remember our Creole population was separated by the rest of the city, by choice, really, by their language, religion, their politics, and now by their neighborhood. They also kind of define themselves with their architecture. And you see that here. So what are we looking at? We're looking at these steep roofs. We're looking at a very urban design where we've got party walls. Again, this is in the French Quarter. And I want you to look at specifically for them, color. We've got bright colors here. These are lime washes that would have originally been used, pigmented lime washes to create all these vibrant colors. Vibrant colors are a way for Creole, French, Spanish-speaking people to essentially announce themselves and to announce their culture. If you remember kind of back to your history lessons with the Protestant Revolution, our English-speaking Protestants who are coming more from a Northern European background, what do they like? They like white. They like clean. Remember, they're rejecting all that color and the opulence connected with Southern Europe cultures and specifically Catholicism. So our Vieux Carré Commission, remember we talked about them, who are very strict, they still regulate paint colors on their historic buildings, and for good reason, because these colors actually represent and are telling a story about the people that built the buildings. Let's see, I'm gonna go down my list. We've got shutters and dormers and wrought iron start to become common materials. You see that here. Green, you see these dark green shutters. Dark green is everywhere. That's because it was one of the first commercially available paint colors that you could go buy, you know, in like the 1700s version of Home Depot. You could go buy a can of green paint. You couldn't go buy all the others, but you could buy green. These buildings are usually constructed of, oh, I'm not a French speaker, briquette entre poteaux, brick and post. We've got brightly colored lime washes. This is a stucco built on top of brick again. And yes. Any questions about this? Okay.
Nope, keep going.
Okay, we're gonna jump into the Antebellum period, talk about some of our early revival styles. Again, we're getting into our Lower Garden and our Garden District, Irish Channel, Carrollton, Algiers, and Marigny. Remember who's building these buildings. Mostly our English-speaking, German-speaking, Protestant settlers coming from other parts of the United States. During the Antebellum period, which is 1830 to 1865, we have this huge Greek revival interest. The Greek revival style can be applied to a very grand building like this. And this is a very strict interpretation of Greek revival, or it can be applied to a more modest structure like this. Greek revival, I'm gonna go back to this, always includes these classical columns, this kind of entablature right here. And just use, you know, I tell my 2-year-old, use your words. What are our words here? When we see this architecture, it's heavy, right? It's straight lines, it's masculine, it's kind of serious. This is an architecture that takes itself very seriously. More masculine, I said that, blocky details. This is probably our best picture of Greek revival right here. We tend to really associate this style with the Antebellum period. You know, think Gone with the Wind and all those stories. This is kind of what you picture is Greek revival. So moving on. Okay, Victorian period, I'm gonna check my time, good. Again, Victorian is not a style of architecture. It is a time period that includes many styles of architecture. We are going to try to get through all the Victorian period architectural styles within the next 8 minutes. So here we go. My favorite. This is the Gothic revival style within the Victorian period. What defines this style? We have very pointy, steep arches right here, or excuse me, here's our pointy arches, steep roof lines. Why do we have this steep roof line? Well, we're drawing this architectural style from a Northern European and New England reference point. This is a roof that is designed to shed snow. That's why it's so steep. We don't get a lot of snow in New Orleans. We certainly don't have to build our roofs, especially for snow, but in the name of architectural styles, we do it sometimes. So, pointed arches, steeply pitched gabled roofs. You see these little teeny tiny diamond shaped window muttons. Again, that's hearkening back to something much older. You see these window hoods right here, decorative millworks in our arches, all beautiful Gothic Revival elements. This is one of my favorites. Okay, Italianate architecture, still within the Victorian period. This is also something that can be applied to very grand buildings or something like a shotgun house. Now, we saw the Greek Revival earlier, which was very heavy, serious, masculine. I want you to think of Italianate as being the feminine, less serious, a little more light and lively version of classical interpretive architecture. We still have our columns and entablature, parapets, we have arches. We have these elements, but they're used in very different ways than we saw with the Greek Revival. Again, lighter, more feminine. I almost want to say a little sillier. You know, it's just not taking itself so seriously. A proper Greek or Roman would never build this, never. This is an interpretation of what they would build. More Italianate. We see a lot of Italianate architecture through the city of New Orleans, and these are just some versions of it. This is a little 3-bay shotgun that I love. Still Italianate. It doesn't have a lot of room to have all these fancy decorative elements, but it makes the most of what it has. Again, these little curved window hoods, these corbels up here. This is a grander example. These double corbels and then these modillion blocks. This nice dormer. Again, a proper Greek or Roman would never build this. It's just a reference. One of my favorite buildings in New Orleans. I wish the picture was a little clearer. Sorry about that, guys. This is the Second Empire style. Again, this is the style. Victorian is the period. We're now getting towards the later part of the Victorian period. Here we've got 1870 to 1885. And the Second Empire, its biggest calling card is this mansard roof. This is a French roof style. Again, mansard roofs were originally built to help shed snow. We don't need that. And you can see how that's applied in New Orleans. Can you imagine living in this roof space with no air conditioning in, 1880? Yuck. But who cares, right? Because it's beautiful. We have this beautiful turret, all these windows. We still have some classical columns on the front. But again, the big calling card is this mansard roof. But this style is not necessarily made for our climate here. Okay, the Eastlake style. Now, there are many kind of other names for this style. We hear gingerbread used a lot. Again, we see a lot of Eastlake style in New Orleans, really in all parts of the city. We're still within the Victorian period, 1880 to 1905 now, so really towards the later part. This is a style that came from furniture design. And because it comes from furniture design, you can kind of see that, right? We have all these little teeny tiny elements, these pierced millworks in here, these little teeny tiny spindles. And this is just silly. This is extravagant and bizarre. We don't need this on a building. This is, like lace on a dress. It's just there to be pretty. We see all these turned, that means rounded, these turned columns, the turned spindles. And oh man, let's use color, let's use different colors every chance we get. It just, more is more in this Eastlake style. We just can't get enough of it. Another way to apply this style, oh, excuse me. This is one of my favorite buildings. This is the Blue Lady on St. Charles Avenue. Great example of the Eastlake style. This is a high style example. And I mean, just the colors, the millworks, everything really sing. Now, in this case, this is a grand house on a very large lot. So you get to see the house from several different angles, right? So it makes sense, and the scale and the massing of this fits the lot. What if you just own a nice little shotgun like this guy? Well, you still have an opportunity to dress it up and put some lace on it, but you do it with brackets. And this is kind of a New Orleans signature calling card of the Eastlake style. And this bracket, or excuse me, Eastlake bracket style is going to really extend into 1920. But again, we're using these elements, these bracket elements, to really bring in all of that extravagance. And color as well, color always. One of the most common architectural styles in our city. Stained glass, fish scale shingles, turned millworks. All of those are still our calling cards. Okay, next style. Again, towards the very end of the Victorian period, the Queen Anne Free Classic. You don't see this style a lot in New Orleans, but it is here, and it signifies a very important moment in New Orleans architectural history. What are we doing? We go from this, which is kind of silly, extravagant, bizarre. Again, it looks like a dollhouse. It's based on furniture. To this. And they're very close cousins. But this is obviously relating back to our classical architecture. Remember that Greek revival? Remember that Italianate? This is relating back to the same kind of inspiration. Again, we have our columns, classical order of columns. They even have them in the correct order. This is the Ionic here on the bottom, Corinthian on top. Ionic is the female column, Corinthian is the godly one. So you always put God on top in architecture. We have a more traditional entablature up here. We're not getting silly with it anymore. We have nice white paint. Again, getting back to classicism here. This, once you see this style, is signaling an end to the Victorian period. We are almost closing out the Victorian period. Our very last gasp of the Victorian period is Richardsonian Romanesque. And boy, you can't miss this style, right? You can't confuse this one with anything else. This was developed by Henry Hobson Richardson, who was from St. James Parish, Louisiana. He became the leading architect, really, in the United States. And huge calling card here, this rough textured stone. He loved that. Again, we're getting back into that heaviness, that massiveness, a little more masculinity, rough textured. We don't see all that fancy, frilly, colorful stuff like we saw over here. I mean, look at the difference between this and this. And really, within the same time frame. Okay, any questions? I think I sped through those, but I got them all.
Okay, so a couple of questions. Mm-hmm. Someone's asking if turrets were often add-ons and not part of an original Italianate house, or if they would have been sort of incorporated from the initial design.
Turrets were usually like, here's a turret, there's a turret, and let's turret. Turrets were almost always originally incorporated. I have In my practice, I don't think I've ever seen a turret that was an add-on that didn't look like an add-on just stuck at the back of a building. Especially on these high style buildings, turrets are going to be part of the original design.
Can you speak to why? Why did those particular styles have turrets?
So this movement in architecture is relating back to a lot of European examples, and turrets recall what? Essentially castles. You know, we do have an opportunity in New Orleans here, like this turret. This is probably a sleeping porch up here. You've got all these windows. You can open all of them up, get kind of a 360 movement of air around you. So in this case, it could actually be a little functional, but they're decorative. You know, this guy's pretty tiny. Turrets, though, require usually, especially one like this, require something called cantilevering, where the framing system is actually tied in and integral to the rest of the building. It'd be very hard to just plop this guy onto the side. The way that this thing is supported in air is because its floor framing system is actually integral to the floor framing system of the rest of the building.
So I think I'm pretty certain that, yeah, the Opera Guild house that's up on the screen now, I think that was an addition.
Oh, okay.
That turret, but an early edition. So I can't remember the exact years. I believe there is an article in Preservation and Print from a couple of years ago that has this information. If I go back in my memory for a few years,
great.
But what you're saying makes sense, because there is actually the space that looks like it's sort of between the turret and what would have been the original building would allow that sort of flooring to make sense and for it to be freestanding. Mm-hmm. So that could be an interesting clue. I don't know that that's necessarily always the case, but certainly the example that you were showing us, the blue house on St. Charles Avenue, clearly that would have been more complicated to build that after the fact.
Yes. And I'm glad you corrected me on that. This little thing, if this is an addition, and I'm sure Serena's correct about that, this little connected piece is called a hyphen. That's one of my favorite architectural terms. These little small, connective bridges. That's what that's called. So, any other questions?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of different questions. Someone's actually asking if the styles, if these different architectural styles, if the interiors vary by style. So would and I know you don't have images to bring up now, but are there like quintessential elements of each of these styles that you would find on the inside of the house?
Yes. So within this Victorian period, oh man, they loved, for the most part, dark colors, patterns, wallpaper. Oh my goodness, wallpaper, heavy curtains. We all love now the exposed hardwood floors on the interiors of our houses, but those were originally just their subfloor, essentially. The exposed hardwoods was not a thing. They were putting rugs, heavy rugs, thick rugs on top of them. I always wonder if somebody from 1875 were to come into one of our houses now and look at our high shine hardwood floors, if they would think like, oh, that's the equivalent of you showing off your plywood subfloor. How tacky. But yeah, interiors for within this Victorian period, think heavy, dark patterns, colors, just think extra. Of course, interiors get updated a lot more quickly and more regularly than the exterior architecture of a house. So, I can't even think, other than a house museum, I can't think of a great example of fully intact Victorian interiors, which maybe is for the best.
Okay, a couple more questions. So going back to Eastlake style homes, we have a couple of questions. So are the details on an Eastlake style home always factory manufactured? And also about Eastlake homes, can an Eastlake home use cast or wrought iron, or do the details need to be made from plaster or wood?
Okay, great questions. So one of the things within the Victorian period and the Eastlake style that made it so popular and readily accessible was that you could order elements like these columns and all these little millworks. You could order these out of a catalog and they would come to you on a railroad and you could slap them on your house and call yourself dandy. You didn't have to necessarily get any of this handmade. You know, turning columns on a lathe is difficult. It's hard work. Same thing with all these little elements. So no, a lot of this was just being ordered through a catalog and being shipped on railroads. Wrought iron and cast iron, that question, what you're looking at here is cast iron. Wrought iron is typically going to be much older. Wrought iron has that, it's usually flatter and it's rolled and hammered. So it looks very, kind of like it's been beaten, you know. You see it a lot in the cemeteries. Cast iron is cast into a mold. So if you see these kind of more delicate shapes, these little finials on top of the fence here, that's cast iron. That was something that was cast into a mold and then piece by piece assembled. There was another question in there, Serena. There was another material question in there.
Would they have all been factory manufactured? I think.
We talked about that. Okay.
Yeah, I think those were the two questions.
Okay.
Okay, so I just want to say, I know that we're running a little bit late. My apologies to everyone. I see that some people are starting to leave the room. I know that we're past the 3 o'clock mark. Michelle and I are used to doing this in person, and we've got a little bit of a tighter ship when we're in person. We're sort of learning how to do this virtually. So thank you for your patience. I know we have a few more questions. I know that people need to go. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. If you're a member of the PRC, thank you, thank you, thank you. You make this possible. If you're not yet, you can become a member at prcno.org. We also have some merchandise that we have been producing. We have some cool t-shirts and stuff. So if you want to support us, there are a bunch of different ways. Please sign up for future classes. Next week, Michelle and I are going to get this a little bit tighter so we can keep it a little bit faster. I think Michelle can stick around for a few more questions as we go. I just wanted to make sure to thank everyone for being here. Someone's asking if they can register for part 2 now. It should be up on prcno.org. So yes, please go register. And we've got some other classes coming up as well. If you have any questions, please always feel free to email me. My email is smohan@prcno.org. And we are going to get back to the questions. So keep them coming for a little bit longer. Okay, so Michelle, let me get back to our list of questions. Someone's asking, at what point did pass-through windows end? So if that's something that we're going to get into next week a little bit more thoroughly, we can do that. But for the time being, just a quick answer would be helpful.
Sure. So pass-through windows haven't ended, really. We still use them. We still incorporate them into architectural designs and build them. You can get a vinyl pass-through window even if you want. Pass-through windows started, and let's see if I've got a good picture of one. This is pretty good. This White House on the right, this is a pass-through window where the window is going all the way to the porch floor. The bottom sash, this part that I'm circling, would slide up past the top sash. Pass-through windows were used in place of doors. You know, I've always been told that property taxes were in part levied based on the number of doors a house included. So a pass-through window was a nice way to get around that rule. It was a way to have a door without being taxed for a door. You used a window that went all the way to the ground. So, yeah.
Okay. I know you talked a little bit about the interiors, but someone's asking if you can follow up with a little bit more information about the floor plans of each of these different types.
That's a great question. So we've been talking about styles. A floor plan references a house form. So we have things like shotguns, we have center halls, double shotguns, things like that. So the floor plan, let's say for a single shotgun, you've got each room, you know, one stacked behind the other. And the idea is that you could stand at the front door and shoot a bullet through the entire house without hitting a wall. It would just go through the front door, all the way through the house and out the back door. So that's a shotgun house. That was really an architectural answer to lot sizes in New Orleans. Our lot sizes are typically very small. They're about 30 feet wide by about 100 to 120 feet long. So when you have a very skinny, narrow lot, you've got to build a very skinny, narrow house. That 30-foot lot, that can usually incorporate a small double. Smaller than that, you get the little single shotguns. So that was the answer. And then the idea of, two, having all the rooms, one behind the other, again, was to help with moving air through the house. You only had one way for air to get in. That was really the front facade, which is so short. So you've got to be able to move it through the rest of the house. And that shotgun house form creates kind of a vacuum to pull that air through.
Okay, one more question about Eastlake style. If you could order parts for the Eastlake style homes in a catalog, then where else was this style of home popular?
Good question. This was popular everywhere, from California to the East Coast. You talk about the Sears and Roebuck catalog. You could actually order pieces for this style of architecture from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And the interesting thing about this, and it's kind of a tangent, because so much of this could suddenly be ordered and it was available en masse to the public. The poorest person could order pieces for their, very, very modest little house. But then the richest people out there could order pieces for their very extravagant house. And we're going to see during the next presentation, within the next 20 years after the Eastlake style and after the Victorian period, people start turning their noses up at this idea, like, ugh, parts made in factories that you get on a railroad, yuck. After this, people start going back to the idea of wanting things to be handmade. So within architecture is like fashion. You're going to constantly be doing these 180 turns, and fashions and tastes change. But yeah, during this time, the idea of ordering that stuff was so popular, it doesn't last very long.
Okay, so I have a question from someone who is not in New Orleans, who would like to know if most of the iconic metal balconies that you see depicted around the city are made from wrought iron. And does the HDLC or other city permitting entity have a system to check the integrity of these balconies, especially any cast iron?
Great question. Most of the iron that you see in the French Quarter and that you associate so heavily with New Orleans is cast iron, not wrought. There's, relatively speaking, there's very little wrought iron in the city compared to the amount of cast iron. Yes, the HDLC does control repair of that cast iron. It's considered a very important architectural element. So even if you're in the French Quarter or the Vieux Carré, let's say you just want to repaint your cast iron balcony, you've got to get that through and approved by the Vieux Carré Commission. Cast iron will rust, so you do have to watch out for that. And the Vieux Carré Commission especially keeps an eye on their buildings, and they will cite you for demolition by neglect if you have a building that you completely fail to take care of. So if you let your cast iron balcony in a French Quarter building just completely fall to pieces and you're letting your whole building fall apart, they'll cite you, they'll give you a citation, and you'll be forced to make repairs. Any other questions? Oops, sorry, Serena, I can't hear you. I see you talking.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a really specific question, but I think that the answer is going to actually speak to something a little bit broader. So someone's saying that their daughter lives in a fourplex a particular fourplex. The location is around the intersection of Washington and Laurel. Would that have been designed as a fourplex, or was it divided later? And I think that that actually speaks to something we were talking about a little bit earlier about multi-family units,
Yes.
multi-unit houses, and sort of when things were divided versus not.
So most of New Orleans, most of our historic districts that we're so used to seeing, like, let's look at this building we're looking at now. This was originally built and designed as a double. Most of the doubles you see are historically doubles, and we always had this house form, and that's pretty unique to this city or to this area of the country anyway. Your daughter living in a fourplex, it'd be hard to answer that without seeing the building. You know, if it's 2 units stacked on top of other 2 units, and it was built after 1900, I'd say it was probably designed as a fourplex. Before that, it'd be hard to tell. Doubles, very, very common. Fourplexes, less so. That's kind of a, oh, it depends answer.
One more quick question. This is about, this is not about the architecture specifically, but someone's actually asking if you have any particular reading recommendations if they would like to learn more about Thomas Sully.
Oh, yes. I think there were books just on Thomas Sully. Thomas Sully was a prolific architect. He's got houses all through the Garden District, beautiful architecture. I don't have any specific reading references on him that come to mind. He's included in almost every New Orleans architecture book, at least his name is. But yeah, him, the Galliers, you know, Richardson, they're very famous architects who are designing in and around New Orleans that, yeah, you can find in general books, and they all have their own publications as well.
I'm going to make a quick plug. It's not specifically about Thomas Sully, but if anyone is looking for a book about New Orleans buildings, the PRC did put out a beautiful coffee table book late last year called Building on the Past. So if you are perusing our website and interested in one of those books, we are shipping them. So please feel free to buy one if you'd like to. If someone is not in New Orleans and is missing travel, we can ship it anywhere. So those are available on our website.
And the New Orleans architecture multi-volume series of books by Mary Louise Kristovich and Rulek Toledano. Those are wonderful. You can buy those through the PRC as well. I think there's 4 or 5 volumes. Those are some of my favorite resources. And they're just called New Orleans Architecture. And then they go through different neighborhoods depending on which volume you're purchasing.
One more question that I wanted to bring up. It sort of goes back to sort of the neighborhood development stuff. Someone's asking about the development of the Garden District. That they've been told that there was some sort of divide between the original Garden District being sort of on one side of Washington and a later version of the Garden District being on the other side of Washington. Can you tell us a little bit about the history or the development of that neighborhood and sort of what that if that's real, if that's sort of urban legend, what does that mean?
I'm not sure that there's like a sharks and a jet story going on there, but Washington Avenue did signal kind of an outskirts of the city. And I think, oh gosh, to the right, if you're looking at our map now, to the right of Washington Avenue, which would be going towards the French Quarter, that was part of New Orleans, and then on the other side was part of the city of Lafayette. Interestingly enough, there's a cemetery on Washington Avenue, Lafayette Cemetery number 1. Cemeteries are always going to tell you that this was originally some kind of outskirts of the city. So now to the development of the actual architecture, sorry, there goes my 2-year-old, within the city, or the development of the architecture within the Garden District. You know, a lot of people are told, oh, it's called the Garden District because each house had this magnificent garden. That That may or may not be true. The term garden actually comes from an older source. The garden district, the land that the garden district sits on and was originally developed from, was a plantation that was originally owned by, I think it was Bienville, one of the city's founders. Now, when he owned this large swath of land and he said, I've got an idea, I want to develop it. I want to, turn this into kind of a money-making opportunity. I'm sorry, here's Garden District over here. The French government at the time said, no, you're a founder. You can't also be a developer. You can't have a plantation of this size. They started kind of looking at him like, what are you doing? And he said, okay, well then fine. I'll keep my land. I won't call it a plantation though. I'll call it my vegetable garden. So that's where the term garden, I've always heard, originally comes from. It's because this entire very large area of the city was this man's vegetable garden. It was called that just to kind of get around some authorities.
Okay, I think we're going to make this the last question. Things have slowed down, but I do have one last question sort of about adaptations. And I want to ask you this, and I also want to sort of, I think this is a really good place to jump off because it'll be something really good for us to bring back up next week. But someone's asking if homes that were originally built in one style, over time with additions have changed to a different style. What is that sort of, how does our architecture adapt, and what does that mean for what style of architecture it actually is, or what type or form of architecture it is?
Yes, so absolutely. Architecture, just like our neighborhoods, is kind of amorphous. It might start as one style, and then over the years, with additions and adaptations, it can change into something else. And we still do that today, right? We update our houses, and we look at the outside of a ranch house maybe, and we say, "Oh, gosh, that looks dated. Let's put some columns on that. Let's open the windows. We'll change this, change that." And we change it to meet current tastes and needs. So I'll try to find a good example of that, a good picture of that happening for next time, because that's a good point.
Okay, I think that is it for today. We're gonna cut it off now. Thank you everyone who stuck around. I know that we're super late, but these were really interesting questions. And thank you, Michelle, for sharing all of this incredible information with us. A few people have asked if you're automatically enrolled for next week. You are not. It's a separate meeting number in the Zoom system. So please go to our website. You can enroll for next week, but we've got plenty of room for everyone. So just make sure you get on there because there'll be a new set of instructions sent to you for that. And we'll see you then. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to email me. Again, my email is smohan@prcno.org. And we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.